Hello and welcome to tonight's Zoom at 8. My name is Julianne Peterson. I'm with Old Capital Lending, and I am here to welcome you tonight to a great evening Zoom call with Yonah Weiss. It is going to be a great night. I'm so glad that you are all here. It's July 21st, 2020. I feel like I'm still stuck in March. A lot has gone on. We had a great deal maker live. I have to think that everybody got something great out of the experience, and I'd love to hear anything. I see some great new faces. Let's see. Who hasn't been here? Ted, I want to hear from you. I'm so glad you're here, Ted. Tell me a little bit about what you're working on, where you're located, and kind of what markets you're going after.
Yeah, I am in Lake Wylie, South Carolina. It's it's a suburb of Charlotte, 20 minutes away. I've been in and out. I'm focusing on, I want to focus on the Northeast areas in terms of apartment buildings, but just getting reaccustomed to everything. So, and I'm glad to be here today.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. As always, we want to provide you with time well spent, and Zoom at 8 is, we always try to provide as much content introducing you to new people, whether it be here on Zoom and building relationships, or offering you some education platform, or like tonight, why we all are into multifamily, the tax benefits, how do we do that? When we go over and speak to our investors, how do we tell them this is a great asset? What do we see in it so we can communicate with other investors, people that you want to have on your team? Is there anybody in the house today that is working on something that may potentially turn into something that you're going to need some investors? And I say that investors here in this group, because remember, these are your people. We are here to support each other. While Michael's platform doesn't have a limited partners that come in and buy into deals, all of us here tonight and on the Slack channel have an opportunity to buy into other people's deals that we're working on. So is there anybody here, before we set ourselves up for some failure on SEC violations up front, let's try and make sure that we are covering our behinds, so that make sure that we know who has the deal, what might be coming up. Anybody in the house?
Julie, I will say I'm gaining some traction in Georgia, in the Augusta, Georgia market. So if there's anybody that's, I saw Ted is in South Carolina. I don't know how, I know that could be kind of close depending on what part you're in, or maybe you're in North Carolina, but if anybody's around that area is interested in finding out more about kind of our approach down there and just wants to network in general about South Carolina, Georgia area, definitely get in touch. I'd love to talk with you.
So Justin, on that, you might have something that may have a need for some investors coming up? Is that something that,
potentially?
Is that maybe in Augusta, maybe around that area?
Could be.
Okay. Yeah, so if anybody's looking to put in some capital into an opportunity in that area, I would highly recommend you talk to Justin. Might be something you're interested in participating in.
Thank you, Julie.
Yes.
I'll be reaching out to you, Justin. I'm interested just to even learn about the market down there.
Absolutely. Yeah, even if you're not, I'd love to tell you guys all about it. I love connecting with people on Slack, and I'm an open book with everything that's going on. So anybody interested, reach out.
And Ted, what's your last name, Ted? I'm around the corner from you.
Clayton, Clayton. Where are you?
I'm in South Charlotte.
Okay, cool.
I'll reach out to you as well, just so we can connect.
Okay, yeah, man.
Yeah, Steve Chan is also in Augusta as well. I think he has a property in contract over there.
Yes, he does, but we want to make sure that we have the relationship. So I'm sure all of you know who Steve Chan is, right? And then, make sure that you're contacting him at the right time, right?
So what we're looking at right now.
All right. Anybody that is on here tonight, if you would please mute yourself so that we can make sure that everybody can hear everybody else. Thank you so much. Now, you guys, I am so glad you showed up tonight. As I said, this is where we love that you're spending an hour of your time with us. Tonight's guest is probably one of the top people to be spending an hour with. If we could spend 3 hours with him, we would love it. Yonah is a master when it comes to cost segregation as well as the internet. If you haven't connected with Weiss, Yonah Weiss, oh my gosh, you should get on LinkedIn right away, connect with him, and you will see the power that Yonah has on LinkedIn. He is a powerhouse for property owners' tax savings. As business director at Madison Specs, a national cost segregation leader, he has assisted clients in saving tens of millions of dollars on taxes through cost segregation. He has a background in teaching and a passion for real estate and helping others. He is a real estate investor himself and host of the new podcast, Weiss Advice. So without further ado, I am so thrilled to have you, Yonah, with us here on our Slack channel, Zoom at 8. I'm going to turn it over to you and everybody. Yonah, do you want us to hold our questions until the end, or would you like it to be free-flowing? What works best for you?
First of all, thank you so much, Julie, for having me and everyone else for taking the time tonight. Whatever you want. I mean, honestly, if you have questions, shoot them at me as fast as possible. I talk pretty fast, so I have slides which I'll share on my screen. If you want to just make me the co-host.
I think you can. You can share right now. Yeah. So awesome. You know what? Why don't we do this instead of having everybody trying to unmute themselves? If you could put the questions in the chat box, and then we'll go ahead and I'll interrupt. I'm terrible at interrupting, as many of you guys know. I've got a lot to say. But you feel free to use the chat box, and then we'll get Yonah to answer our questions. So Yonah, you're on. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you again. And it's great to see a bunch of familiar faces and a lot of new people. So yeah, like Julie said, please connect with me. LinkedIn, that's the best place to stay in touch with me. I'm very, very active there, not just daily, but hourly or minutely, perhaps. But we're going to learn a lot tonight about cost segregation specifically. I hope to touch on some very key, important points when it comes with regard to passive investors as well, because I know that's something that a lot of us here are dealing with and want to be able to share that knowledge information with them as well. So we'll get some of you may have some overview what cost segregation is. I hope to cover everything that you possibly ever wanted to know about it in about a half an hour, 40 minutes or so. And then, and throughout, please ask questions. So let's just go right into it. Here we go. One second. Okay, now we got it. Okay, slideshow from the beginning. There we go. Magical world of cost segregation. That's what I like to call this, because for some people it's just like magical. And we'll see some of these terms, some of the actual things that we learn in the tax benefits that come with cost segregation are literally just phenomenal. I mean, almost magical, like magical fairy dust is going on when we're talking about these tax benefits. So that's why I like to call it magical world over there. Nevertheless, without further ado, my name is Yonah Weiss. I work, like Julie said, I work for a company, Madison Specs. We're the largest national company that does cost segregation. I know we work with Michael Blanc and a lot of the big syndicators out there as well. So feel free to reach out with any questions. We're going to cover depreciation. Depreciation is really, something that a lot of people don't really understand. They think about it as like this great, cool concept, but don't understand how it actually works, because according to the tax code, as we're going to talk about tonight, it actually is very complex. And with cost segregation, we can actually use that depreciation to maximize the tax benefit for ourselves or investors during the hold period. We'll talk about bonus depreciation. Some people think it's different than cost segregation. It's actually not. We'll talk about the new tax code as well. The new, not tax reform, not tax code, but the CARES Act actually put something new into the tax code that is very, very beneficial for real estate investors currently. Talk about what's a real estate professional. And this is a huge topic, especially when you're dealing with passive investing. You want to make sure, and active investing as well, but passive investing, you want to make sure you understand what that real estate professional status is. This is a terminology that was created by the IRS. And if you have this status, you're basically, like I said, this is like the golden ticket of taxes. We'll do a short case study and then kind of open up to questions from there. So depreciation, okay, it sounds negative, right? Everyone understands the concept of depreciation, that things go down in value as time goes on, right? Now, that's true, but from a tax standpoint, when it comes to real estate, it's really a borrowed term. And what I mean by that is real estate is probably one of the only things that exists that is intrinsically going up in value as time goes on. So it's naturally appreciating. Nevertheless, you get to take a tax deduction called depreciation, which basically means the purchase price that you spend on a property is now taken and as a tax write-off over the course of 27 and a half years for residential multifamily properties, or 39 years for commercial properties. Now, this is, when I say it's a borrowed term, because it's not intrinsic in the building. It's not intrinsic in the building that you bought, because if it were, then that depreciation schedule, those 27 years, would start the day the building was built, and it would finish after 27 years, but it's not so. The day depreciation starts, if you're doing new construction, then yes, it starts when you build it. But if you buy an existing property, it starts from the day that you buy it, which means you could buy an existing building. And I get this question all the time. Well, the sellers own this building for 40 years. It's fully depreciated. That's true for him. But now you buy it as a new buyer, depreciation starts over from day one. Depreciation, again, is this tax deduction that you get off your income tax to offset your income tax, which is great. But there's actually a way, and this is what cost segregation is. Weird name, right? The cost segregation, we're segregating the cost. Okay, we're splitting up the cost, the overall cost of the building into different categories, segregating out into different components. And that is, over 5 years, 7 years, 15 years, we're going to see what these categories are. I'm going to break it down. So let's take an example. Let's say you bought a building for $1 million. The first thing we always have to do is allocate a certain amount for land. Land does not depreciate. Okay, so I put here 15%. It's a pretty average number. There's some places in the country where it's even more, some places where it's less. It really depends on the location. It can depend on the type of property or the amount of land there actually is in there versus the building and the improvements. But 15% is pretty average. So what you're left with is $850,000. That's called your depreciable basis. Now this, when you're doing straight line depreciation, which is what most people do, your accountant is going to do this if you don't tell them otherwise. And people think that this is actually the proper way to do it. It's not. It's actually the improper way to do it. As we'll see shortly, cost segregation is actually the proper way to depreciate your property. This is what straight line depreciation looks like. For 39 years, it means commercial buildings, retail, office, self-storage, you name it, anything besides multifamily, is $21,794 a year. So it means you buy the property this year. The first year is always prorated. Depreciation is prorated from the day that you buy it for that year, but that means that you now get to take, that's great, $21,000 tax deduction, pretty cool. $30,000, $909 if it's a residential multifamily property, that's awesome, right? That means if you're making a net operating income of, let's say, $50,000, $60,000 on this $1 million property, that's great, right? Immediately you get to subtract $30,000 and you're only paying taxes on the remaining 30. But what if there was a way, and this is what cost segregation does, to actually knock out that entire tax liability to zero, and potentially for not just the first year, but the first 5 years, then that's what we're going to be doing here. So just moving right along, how we actually do this and what the fundamentals are. One of the things, and there's a whole guideline, I'm going to get to it later at the end, about the cost segregation audit techniques guide, which is the playbook in the tax code. You can go to the IRS website and look it up and see everything that needs to go into a proper quality cost segregation study. But one of those components is that an engineer actually needs to be involved in the process to identify what those assets are. What we're going to be doing is coming to a building and identifying all the different aspects. Now with new construction, it's very easy because you have line items, you have invoices, you know exactly what was spent for each item. You know that, $100,000 was spent on paving the parking lots and the curbs, and $50,000 on the carpeting and the cabinets, et cetera. Everything's already broken down. But when you buy an existing asset, you have to kind of do that and reverse engineer the property and what's the useful life and what's the replacement cost and what's that calculation. And that's really what we're doing, is we're coming and understanding from the tax code what all those assets are. So breaking out those components and creating a new depreciation schedule, which will allow you to take these huge deductions in the earlier, accelerate that depreciation, so to speak, to the earlier lives. So here's an example. This is actually a breakdown of the actual case study we're going to do later on. So the main two categories when we're talking about, really there's four categories. There's land. Again, land does not depreciate. There's the building, the main structure, and structural components are, as we said, that's really what depreciates on a 27.5-year or 39-year schedule. So you have to remember, that's always going to be the main thing in the property. There are certain exceptions, but usually the main thing is that structural components. What's left is these two other categories called personal property and land improvements. There are a couple other smaller things that are very rare. They depreciate on 7-year, 10 years, even some things on 20 years, but these are the main categories. I'm not going to get into the tiny details of those things that are very rare. So 5-year and 15-year are the most common. And these are 5 years personal property. And that can include anything, really, if you think about anything in the building, it's not part of the structure, okay, not integral to the structure. So wall, roof, doors, windows, floor, that's all integral. Even main plumbing and main electric, those things are integral to the property. Everything else basically is considered personal property. So appliances, furniture, right, equipment, flooring, okay, carpeting or vinyl flooring. But not only that, things that you wouldn't even think of, like you see over here, building mounted signage, okay, decorative lighting, decorative moldings, millwork, all these things, the value of each of those items has a significant value in some cases, and that's the job of the engineer to identify how much of that is in each unit, how much of that is in the property, create a study, create this whole report, basically, which is in the end of the day about 80, 90, 100 pages long, which details everything in there, and then there's calculations of what the cost is and how we can depreciate it faster. The 15-year property, that's land improvements. These things are somewhat overlooked because we understand land does not depreciate, but land improvements do. So the landscaping, the concrete, you have pavement, and there's different types of pavement. There's the curbing, there's the sidewalk, there's the bollards, all these different things have different values to them. And when we calculate what those values are, we can take those tax deductions faster. And this is really, really important because taking these faster deductions, really just taking advantage of those deductions earlier on so that you can use them when you need them, as opposed to paying taxes. If there's really, this is the basis of the entire thing. If there's a way to pay taxes, pay less taxes, then why not do that, okay? We're not creating deductions out of thin air, but what we're doing is we're front loading certain deductions so you can take advantage of it. It's increasing your cash flow, and it's creating this time value of money. And so what I mean by time value of money, everyone understands this concept, is that $1 today is worth more than $1 5 years from now. But if you don't have to pay taxes, you don't have to pay this, and maybe, perhaps, and I say maybe because there are many strategies to get around it later on, maybe I'm gonna have to pay later on taxes, I'm gonna take advantage of it now. And some people think of it like an interest-free loan, right? Like you're you're borrowing money from the IRS, so to speak, because you're gonna maybe have to pay those taxes later on. But really, if you think about it, it's not borrowing money from the IRS, it's your money in the first place. It's borrowing money from yourself, from your future self, from what I may have to pay taxes later on. I'm gonna borrow that so that I can use that money now. And the cash flow that you can have is not only distributed to the investors, it's also can be used to reinvest into the property. It can be reinvested into other property. And so that money has not just the value, not just because of inflation, and not just because that $1 today is worth more than 5 years from now, it's what you can do with that money now. And so that's the most important part over here. So that's really, in a nutshell, what the concept of cost segregation is. It's taking these deductions at a faster rate, and I'm going to get into some numbers later on in the case study of actual numbers, and allowing yourself to have these, literally little to no tax liability whatsoever. So who should be doing this? And this is really a question a lot of people ask. And this comes up especially in terms of syndications. And why is it going in syndications? Because especially nowadays, people are investing from retirement accounts, for example. So anyone who's taxable can do cost segregation because you get depreciation. If you're a nonprofit entity, you don't get any depreciation. If you have a tax sheltered retirement account that you're investing from, for example, solo and 401k or something like that, something to that extent, QRP is sometimes some people call them, which is just kind of like an overall terminology for that tax structure. Roth IRAs, these things are not taxable structures, which means you don't benefit from the depreciation because it's already tax-free money. So therefore, the cost segregation will not be relevant. And this is important to understand because if you have the majority, and I have a friend of mine who's very active on Bigger Pockets, and he's a big syndicator, and he's a CPA actually. And all of his investors, he has this set up in such a way that all of his investors invest through retirement accounts. And that's how he invests. All of his syndications are like that. He's a CPA, he understands this. He never does cost segregation because it will never benefit any of his investors. So it's something important to understand. It's not for everyone. It can be. Anyone can do it, but the question is, will you benefit from it? And so it doesn't matter if it's a corporation. There are some different tax rules when it comes to corporations. Doesn't matter if it's an LLC, it's going to be a pass-through, okay? Because if you have an LLC, that's just a pass-through entity. You and your partners or your investors, limited partners, general partners, will have a percentage of ownership of the property and will get the deductions according to your percentage of ownership or according to your percentage of cash flow, however you structure that. So essentially, if you have, let's say, just keep it simple. If you have a partnership of 10 partners and each of you invest $100,000 and you're each getting 10% returns, you're each getting $10,000 a year, and you're going to be getting $10,000 of depreciation. So you're each going to get that that amount. You're going to get the returns and you're going to get the depreciation equally according to your percentage of ownership. So what is this really? Any questions so far, by the way?
There was one question. Are there any rules of thumb for underwriting and using cost segregation? And I think that will probably be covered. So what do you think about that?
That's not my kids.
Not mine either. Hey, Rodney. Let's see.
But yeah, there in terms of underwriting, one of the things that we do, which is it's not necessarily a rule of thumb because every property is different. However, I will get to a little bit later that depending on the type of property, I assume most people in here are in the multifamily space, if not everyone. Different types of commercial properties, and correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone's in different spaces, but other types of commercial properties will have different benefits when it comes to cost segregation. How much percentage will actually be reallocated to these faster lives? How much of that percentage can be taken as an upfront deduction? It's going to differ. It's typically for multifamily properties somewhere between 20-30% in those earlier years. Can be more, can be less, depending. However, we will touch on that a little bit later on. Real estate professional status, which is a really important one. Real estate professional status, like I mentioned before, is an actual IRS tax terminology. And this is really important. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this before. It's a little bit elusive. Maybe some people don't realize how important this actually is. But in my eyes, this is probably the most important rule in the tax code. And if you're not a real estate professional, you or your spouse, you probably should be considering becoming one, as you'll see shortly, because the definition is that either you or your spouse has to spend more than half of your time involved in materially participating in real estate trade or business. So that involves anything like developing, redeveloping, all this stuff in the second column over here, constructing, reconstructing, acquiring. So that can include, underwriting and the acquiring process, actual spending the time buying properties, converting it, renting, leasing, operating, managing, or brokering properties. So if you're a broker, you're involved in your own properties, you most likely will be this real estate professional status. You don't have to have a license. You don't have to be a broker in order to get the status. Again, you just have to own property and you have to spend the majority of your working time during the year in this trading business. So if you have a W-2, it's probably going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to also have this real estate professional status. And many couples that, may have very high income and also investing in real estate and both are W-2 jobs. I know, several cases where, one spouse decides to just quit their job, right? Or retire, whatever you call it, because the advantage of having the tax deductions, as we'll see shortly, is so much that it pays more to not work and to just get the money from your real estate and to take advantage of these tax deductions. So what exactly are these tax benefits involved with the real estate professional? So usually, and let me see if I have another slide here. Yeah. So usually there's really is two things. Depreciation is considered a passive deduction. Okay. Real estate income from rental properties is considered passive income. Depreciation is used, passive deduction, to offset passive income. That's the simple rule. Okay. Passive deduction to offset passive income. Any of your properties, if you have rental properties, even if you have 100 rental properties, they can all be used, the depreciation can be used to offset all of it, okay? All across the board. However, those depreciation deductions and the huge amount of depreciations that we're creating with cost segregation, especially with bonus depreciation, which we'll get to in a few slides, is limited to the passive income, okay? So depreciation, passive deductions offsets the passive income. However, if you're a real estate professional, that rule does not apply. You can now use these passive deductions, so depreciation and huge amounts of it, instead of just creating a passive loss, which will, just kind of sit there and carry forward and not be able to use, you can use the extra deductions to offset any of your income. So I'm going to just repeat that in different words because it's so important. If you or your spouse is a real estate professional, you can now create $1 million of, for example, of depreciation. Even if you have $100,000 of income from your real estate properties, you can use the rest of that to offset any of your other income. Okay, so simple example. I have a client who was actually a recent guest on the Weiss Advice podcast. You can check that out, Weiss Advice. We didn't talk about it that much. Weiss Advice. It's a play on words, obviously. But what we talked about there is that he is a real estate broker. Who's making a lot of money and was paying a few $100,000 a year in income tax, okay? Which, some people will say, that's great. You make a lot of money, you pay a lot of taxes, right? Wrong, okay? If you're a real estate professional, if you're a real estate investor, you should not have to be paying income tax. It's as simple as that, especially using cost segregation and other strategies. So what did he do? He's this real estate professional. He did cost segregation. We created bonus depreciation. We bought a $4.5 million multifamily building. First year bonus depreciation, over $1 million tax write-off. He paid zero income tax that year. So he was able to use the $1 million to offset the about $200,000 or so of income from the property. Maybe it was a little less. And then the rest of the $800,000 was to offset his other active income. So he basically paid, no income tax that year. So that's really the point, is using these deductions to your advantage. So now, when you're talking to passive investors, okay, which is really important, many passive investors may not be real estate professionals, okay? However, it's actually probably a good target, okay? If you can target real estate brokers and people like that, or property managers or people who are involved in construction workers, things like that. Maybe they don't have like a huge W-2, but if they're making a lot of money in income, it's a great way for them to just shelter that income through syndications, especially if you're using cost segregation. And if you are yourself, obviously you're going to benefit from it. If you guys are the leads, general partners, you obviously will benefit from this because you can use the extra deductions to offset any of your other income. So if you have acquisition fees, management fees, et cetera, those fees are considered ordinary income. Those fees are not considered rental property income, which depreciation would normally offset. You're going to need extra deductions and you're going to need this real estate professional status. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's real estate professional status. There's more to it, obviously. Everything in a tax code, there's more to it. We're trying to sum it up as as simple as possible to simplify things to make it for everyone. So yeah, the one exception to this is if you make less than $150,000 of adjusted gross income a year, then you can use some of that passive losses, those extra depreciation deductions, to offset your other income, okay? So that's the one exception. So let's get into tax cuts and jobs. Everyone's heard of bonus depreciation, right? Raise your hand if you have not heard of bonus depreciation before. I think everyone's heard of bonus depreciation. Okay, but what is bonus depreciation? 100% bonus depreciation. Okay, it used to be a law, okay, prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was the end of 2017, 2018, that for new construction properties, the money you spent could 50% of that could be not the money you spent, the money that was spent on faster depreciation categories could be used as a 50% write-off. Forget that because it doesn't exist anymore. They made it that any property that depreciates under 20 years. So basically, when you do a cost segregation study, what we're doing again is finding all that faster depreciation, finding things that depreciate faster. 5-year personal property, 15-year land improvements. Remember that the whole list over there before? The appliances, the furnishings on the one hand, and the landscaping, pavement, retaining walls, signage, all that stuff on the outside. All of that stuff, and again, multifamily, we're talking 20 to 30%. Instead of straight line depreciation deduction, think about this for a second. We're taking $30,000 on a $1 million purchase. So we're taking about a 3% deduction every year for 27 years. Cost segregation in the first 5 years, you can possibly take 20%. So we're looking at, instead of 3% a year, you're looking at more like 7 to 8% a year. Because again, there's a 3% plus the additional 20%. So that's great. That's increasing that. But what about taking that entire 20% in the first year? And that's exactly what bonus depreciation is. Bonus depreciation allows you to take the entire amount of accelerated depreciation as a first year tax write-off. Okay. And the reason why a lot of people will want to do this is, number one, you don't lose it. If you can't use it this year, you don't lose it. It just carries forward as considered a passive loss. Okay. It's a passive loss. If you can use it, meaning if you have more deductions than you have income, if you're a real estate professional, you can use those extra deductions to offset other income. If you have no more income and all of your income is sheltered and you literally have no income tax liability, you don't lose it, it just carries forward. It's considered a passive loss, carries forward to future years. Another reason why it's important to do this now especially is because according to the current tax code, the tax reform, this is going to start phasing out in 2023. So now is the time to take advantage of this. And who knows what's going to be if, after the elections happen, if there's going to be new tax reform, they're talking about doing away with 1031 exchanges and who knows what they're going to do. But right now, this is what the system is. So definitely good to take advantage of it now. Another reason why it's so important to take advantage now is something that they just put in the CARES Act a couple of months ago, which was net operating losses. So again, if you have this huge net operating loss, this passive loss, like I said, it carries forward, but they just reintroduced a law that used to be years ago, but now they reintroduced it, that now you can not only carry it forward, but you can also carry it back, okay? Carry back means that if you paid taxes in the past 5 years, any income tax whatsoever, you can now do a cost segregation, okay, create this huge amount of passive loss, and now amend your previous year's tax returns and get a refund check for any taxes you paid in any previous year. So that's called a net operating loss carry back. So you can do that up to 5 years back. This is a huge thing. I've heard a lot of accountants talk about this and suggesting for a lot of people to do cost segregation that wouldn't necessarily be the most advantageous for them because maybe you don't have an income tax liability this year, but maybe you paid taxes in previous years. So do the cost seg now. Go back, amend. It's not as simple as it sounds because you do have to amend your tax returns, number one. You do have to have your accountants to file a special form, for changing the depreciation and also changing, the long net operating loss. Excuse me. So it's not as simple. Definitely something to speak to your accountant about if it is relevant to you. But another huge win for real estate and for cost segregation when it comes to this department. When should you be doing this? And this is a question, obviously, a lot of people want to know. When should you be doing cost segregation study? A lot of people like to, and this goes to your point, I don't know who asked this before, but is there a process in the underwriting process? When do we do this? A lot of people reach out to us, especially since we provide a free estimate. So we provide a free analysis for anyone, any property whatsoever. So even if you have something under contract, you can see, even before you acquire it, upfront, what are your tax benefits going to be? and it's pretty accurate. We do it obviously very conservatively, so it's like the minimum tax benefit you're going to get by doing a cost segregation study. And we'll show you a comparison charts. This is what your straight line depreciation would be. This is what it would look like if you do cost segregation. And it's pretty straightforward, pretty clear, easy to see what the benefit is, and like a no-brainer basically. So people do it immediately. You don't have to do it immediately. Obviously, the bonus depreciation is a huge advantage of doing it in the first year, but you can actually do this retroactively. So let's say you bought a property a few years ago and you never did cost segregation on it. You can now do it this year and catch up the depreciation. And doing it this way, you don't have to amend your tax returns. There's a simple form to file, 3115 form. We do that for you. But what you're doing is essentially taking all the 5-year depreciation, all that category, the huge category of 5-year property that you should have taken in the previous years, you didn't take, you can now catch that up and take it all this year when you file your taxes. So that's a great thing to know as well. Another thing important is when you're doing renovations, okay? As I stated at the beginning, the cost basis of a property, meaning your depreciation, how much you can write off, is totally based on your purchase price. It's not based on the value of the building. It's not based on a new appraisal. It's not based on refinance. That won't change anything. It's based solely on how much was spent, okay? Your original purchase price. The only time that does change is when you make additions to the property. When you add money, you do renovations, you're adding more money into the property, that money gets added to your depreciable basis. That money gets depreciated as well. And you can take that as just lump it into a 27.5 year, or you can break it down and do a cost segregation study on those renovations. And there's actually 2 components to this. There's what's called a partial asset disposition, which is writing off anything that you've actually disposed of. Okay, you threw away all the old sinks and cabinets, so you can actually write that off, take a one-time tax write-off, and that's pretty cool. But the second part of that is any money that was spent to put in those new cabinets, those new appliances, all of that can now be depreciated at a faster rate and taken the first year bonus depreciation as that on that as well. And obviously, new construction, this works, and it's pretty good for new construction. Of course, this only applies to rental property. Okay, cost segregation does not apply to your personal residence and does not apply to any type of property that is just being bought and sold. So not flips, things like that. So if you're a contractor, you're building a property to sell, it doesn't apply. So again, this is just going to be buy and hold, rental real estate. And here's really a chart that will give us a little more insight into which properties are more advantageous to do. And this kind of goes to your question on the underwriting. Apartments are up there. There are different types of properties that may have a higher, and this is an average. There are certainly certain types of properties that go up to 40% in the multifamily as well, but on average, it's somewhere around 27 to 30% is how much, and this is the allocation. Again, we're taking the purchase price, we're subtracting for land, and whatever's left, about 25, 30% of that is going to be in that faster depreciation lives. As you can see here, there are tons of every type of commercial property has a benefit in doing this. Mobile home parks are off the charts, okay? Golf courses are with them, and the reason for that is simply because they're almost entirely land improvements. So there's, especially if you don't own any of the homes, and obviously the golf course is the same, what you own is just the land improvements, not just the land, but again, the land improvements, the concrete, the landscaping, the concrete pads under each home. That's all you own. If that's the case, that's almost the entire purchase price. I mean, literally, we've seen anywhere from 40 up to 80% of the purchase price, can go into that 15-year category. So that's pretty big. If anyone's looking for people, I get asked all the time, what's the one property, if I want to get the biggest tax deduction I possibly can this year? What's the one? What should I buy? Either a mobile home park, RV park, right, or a golf course. Obviously, you may not want to do that for other reasons, but that's up to you.
Yonah, I have a question for you. If you
Yes.
take bonus depreciation, is there a minimum time period you have to hold the property before you can sell it, and not have to pay the depreciation back? Or we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So there's you cannot do bonus depreciation if you're buying and selling in the same tax year. So that's the only caveat to that. There's no such thing as paying depreciation back. Okay, this is a misnomer that there's something called depreciation recapture, which I'm sure everyone's heard of before. but it's a misnomer. It does not mean that you pay back the depreciation. It means that there's a tax upon the sale of a property. There's a tax called depreciation recapture tax, which means that you have to now be taxed on the amount of depreciation that was taken. This is a misconception in a lot of ways. Obviously, it's something that needs to be taken into consideration in your business plan. You have to realize, I'm going to be taking these depreciation deductions up front. What happens when I sell? I'm going to have capital gains tax potentially. I'm going to have depreciation recapture tax potentially. How am I going to have to mitigate that? So there are a few ways around that. We can get into that in a few minutes.
Here's a side question, Yonah.
Mhm.
How do you prove that you spend 750 hours of service in real estate related work during the tax year?
That's a great question. And if you are claiming the real estate professional status, you really do have to document and claim that. So it is really a good question. People do it. There's certain apps nowadays. I don't know any offhand. People just track it with Excel. You know, just track your hours. What are you doing? You know, how are you spending? 750 hours is not a lot of time. It's about 15, 16 hours per week. But you have to track that. It has to be real also. Like if you were to ever get challenged by an audit, you would need to show that. You would need to show how you spent your time. So it's a good idea to track that. Say, you know, I spent X amount of time on underwriting. I spent X amount of time on traveling to the property. I spent X amount of time, you know, dealing with the banks and the operating and the asset management and et cetera. Whatever you're doing, just, you know, kind of log those hours, if you will. Again, there are plenty of apps that can do that as well. But again, if you have a W-2 job, it's probably not even worth it, because unless you have a major intensive amount of property management going on that you're dealing with, that you're spending, you know, more than 40 hours or 50 hours a week also doing that, and you can prove that, then, you know, maybe it's worth doing that. Otherwise, you're probably not going to get away with it. Yeah. So let's just jump right into the case study over here. And this is a great case study for a number of reasons. It's a small deal. I mean, relatively, obviously, it's all relative, but, you know, 1.75 million. This was a guy who had a lot of single family properties and ended up having a failed 1031 exchange. And I'll get into why it was a failed 1031 exchange. He ended up selling them, and he wasn't able to identify proper properties in the right amount of time. Later on in the year, he ended up buying this multifamily building, not through the 1031 exchange, and he was able to get so much depreciation that instead of paying the capital gains tax, he was able to wipe out the capital gains tax because of the extra depreciation as well. So without cost segregation, the depreciation on this property would have been $54,000 a year. Okay, and that's great. Again, you get this free deduction, right? You get depreciation deduction. However, you know, he had close to $100,000 of income, right? Net operating income from the property. So you still have $50,000 in change to have to pay taxes on. So what do we do over here? So this is this is pretty typical. I'm using this example because it's pretty average for multifamily, especially garden style multifamily properties. We had about, again, a 15% allocation for land. Land does not depreciate. And then the remaining amount, which was, you know, close to 1.5 million, 27.5 year property. Again, that's all the structure. That's always going to be the main component. 72% of the entire basis is in those components: the walls, the floors, the doors, the windows, you know, all that good stuff. The other stuff, and this is really where it gets, you know, that whole list that I showed you before, which is a 5-year property, 20% in that 5-year property. And again, we're not just throwing darts at the wall and percentages, really taking a toll of every tiny detail of every asset, everything, you know, how many cabinets, how many square footage, you know, how much carpeting, every unit, et cetera, the whole thing. It's, again, like a 100-page report, very detailed. We come up with this 20%, 8% into the 15-year, the land improvements again. So we're talking $420,000 of accelerated depreciation. And he was able to do bonus depreciation that first year. And what he ended up doing is on this $100,000 of income, he had an extra $320,000 of depreciation. He was not only able to use that to offset some of his ordinary income, but to offset the capital gains tax that he you know, would have had to pay because of the failed 1031 exchange. So this is a great story on multiple levels. It's not, and I'm saying this, that it was a great story for him. It may not be for you the best use to offset the capital gains tax. Some people might want to just, pay it. Why? Because capital gains tax is probably 20 to 25%, and your ordinary income tax rate might be much higher. So that depreciation might be best used to offset your ordinary income and just keep it as a passive loss till next year. But again, this is the story. This is how it happened. He was very happy that he didn't have to pay any of his tax. And yeah, so I saw there's a bunch of more questions there. Do you want to chime in with anything?
Nope, we're all covered right now. There was one question that said investor relations, creating content and marketing. Does that count for real estate professional?
No. No.
Oh, I
don't think so.
answered that wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
Really? Even
yeah,
though
because
that's part of his business.
it is part of the business. If it could be considered, operations, because it's more about the property than about the investment. We think of it like that. Like we're really talking about materially participating in real estate.
Well,
and
what
not
about marketing your house, your property for rent? That would be considered.
Yeah, that might be. So you're talking about marketing properties as opposed to marketing for syndications or things like that. I was understanding you're talking about marketing for the investment as opposed to marketing for renting properties. There are two different things there. So they should be distinguished because one, you're right, probably would be considered for the real estate professional status because that's involved in actual operations of the property, whereas the other is more on the investment side.
Okay, thank you. Property management itself would qualify though, correct?
Yes,
Yes.
correct. Property management, asset management, operations, and all that good stuff. So this page over here is literally taken straight out of the cost segregation audit techniques guide, which is just the principal elements of a quality cost segregation study. So it's the 13 principles over here. It's pretty complicated, meaning doing this is not just, like I said, accountants can't do this. And this is pretty much why, a lot of accountants won't even know about this. Because it's an engineering aspect, because it's like this one kind of far off, tucked away place in the tax code that if you're not deeply involved in real estate, if you're an accountant, you probably don't even know about it. I can't tell you how many accountants I've spoken to that literally had no idea what cost segregation was. To me, it's no longer surprising. It's just, kind of my job is just putting the word out there, like getting people to know what is available to them and understand that your accountant, may not be a specialist, okay? And that's okay. But if you're going into real estate, you probably want to have a real estate specialized accountant so that you can take advantage of all these different things. So again, this is really, really complicated. We do all the work for you, right? Obviously you can't do this on your own. Accountants can't even do this on their own. You need the engineering component and you need this, the experience in creating these studies. Like I said, it's a very detailed report that goes along with it. Not just creating that updated depreciation schedule, which in the end of the day is really what it's all about. So a little bit about us. I don't need to talk about myself, but we're the biggest national company. Like I said, saved over $3 billion in taxes for our clients over the past 15 years. So it's pretty good. So yeah, just more questions. There's my contact information if anyone wants to reach out to me. But again, the best way to reach me is on LinkedIn. And I guarantee you will, if you don't have a LinkedIn account yet, or you're not active on that platform, you should be, because it's literally probably the most underrated social media platform out there. And as opposed to what it used to be, just like a place to post your profile, your resume, and a place to find a job, it's literally become an incredible resource for networking and doing business and meeting people and, creating content, engaging with content. It's great. That's all I want to say.
Awesome.
I do want to go back a minute. There was a question, and I wanted to cover that depreciation recapture tax because it's an important thing, especially when it comes with regards to your passive investors. And this might come up because you may be, it's all may be great. And the main advantage for passive investors, I would say, if they're not a real estate professional, is that, listen, this is an investment that during the hold period, especially if it's like a 5-year hold, which is pretty typical, you are going to be getting returns and you're not going to pay tax on those returns. That's pretty much it. I mean, that's as simple as you can put it. Find me any other investment vehicle that you get a return on investment and you're not going to pay taxes on that return on investment during the investment period. There's very few. Maybe oil, but again, oil is not that good of an investment nowadays. There are tax advantages with that as well. So again, that's the main kind of pitch, if you will, for passive investors. What they might, you want to make them aware of is this thing called depreciation recapture tax, which is important because, again, you're going to be hit with it at the end when you sell a building. There are ways to get around that if you 1031 exchange, which hopefully that will continue on. Everyone go out and vote, because it doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, but if you're a real estate investor, you don't want to get the Democratic candidate in office if he's saying what he's going to do. It just doesn't make any sense to do away with 1031 exchanges just like that, like pull out the carpet under, from out everyone who's created this, business plan for decades. Anyways, that's, but without a 1031 exchange, there's another strategy that I mentioned briefly called the partial asset disposition. And again, without getting too complicated into tax structures and whatnot, it's very simple. When you sell a property, you can actually, if you've done cost segregation, you can now, because you've identified what all that 5-year property, all that personal property is, you can now, at the sale of property, allocate your disposal of the property. You're selling the property, you can allocate a little to no amount to that 5-year property. So, for example, you have cabinets, you have carpeting, all that stuff depreciates on 5 years. If you held the property for 5 years, you can now allocate, like, let's say $50,000 was in the carpeting and the cabinets, you allocate $0 to the carpeting cabinets. You actually no longer have that. It's subtracted from the basis. When you go to sell the property, guess what? You no longer pay depreciation recapture tax on that amount because there's no more value in it. So that's another great way to get around. You're always going to have to pay the recapture tax on the structural component because there's no way of getting around that except for the 1031 exchange. But the other stuff that you are accelerating, you think, well, why am I going to take this huge amount of depreciation up front if I'm just going to have to pay a tax on a larger amount later on when I sell? So besides for the time value of money, which is obviously good, besides for the cash flow that you get now, you also have, a way to mitigate that, a way to reduce that significantly later on.
Wow. I need to take a nap after all of that. That is amazing.
Okay.
I know that there are some questions out in our group here. I did see one, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Where did our question go? So the question is the service you offer a layer on top of my CPA to perform a cost segregation portion?
Yes. Again, as I mentioned, accountants cannot do this. Let me rephrase that. There are many accounting firms, the large Big 4 and big 10 accounting firms that have engineers on staff in-house that do this. 95% of accounting firms do not do cost segregation in-house. So your accountant can't do this. Yes, you need a third-party firm to do this. We work with accountants. We're not an accounting firm ourselves. All we do is specialize in cost segregation. So yeah, this is a layer on top of your taxes.
So you say that this is great for homes, your single families and multifamilies and all those others, but does it make sense on a single family rental? I mean, the cost to do a cost segregation is what, $10,000?
No, not that much. Rarely we'll ever get that much. I mean, for us, average is somewhere between $4,000 to $5,000 to do a cost segregation study. Smaller properties can be even less. Some larger properties a little more, but for multifamily, it's pretty much in that range. So yeah, what's the advantage? I rarely, even with that, you'll see that, again, if you just take the percentages, think about it for a second. If you have $1 million property, we saw about 20% of that, you're getting about $150,000 to $200,000 tax benefit. To pay $5,000 for that makes sense, okay? It's not contingent. Again, our fees are not contingent whatsoever, but with a $10 million building, it's gonna be the same price as the $1 million building, just because the scope of work is around the same. For a $500,000 property, just cut that in half, right? You're talking about maybe $80,000, $70,000, tax benefit. The smaller you get, the lower you get, the lower basis you get, the smaller the property is, the less it makes sense. Okay, obviously you're gonna get benefit from it, but to what extent? Okay, and then starts pushing down. You know, am I gonna pay $5,000 to get, you know? And we're talking about tax deductions, and the after-tax benefit is lower, right? So if you have a $100,000 tax deduction, you're paying a $30,000 tax rate. So that's about a $30,000 tax benefit, after tax, you know, net present value kind of benefit. So under my rule of thumb is under $500,000 probably doesn't make sense. There are occasions when it does, but anything above that, it usually makes sense at least to reach out to see what those numbers would be.
Excellent.
And not really,
Anybody-
it doesn't have to do with single family, multi, it doesn't have to do, has most to do with the actual purchase price.
With costs, with the bonus depreciation, if we don't get in the next year, what do you speculate will happen? I know it just depends on what happens in the White House, right? But will we see multifamily being the value that it is right now, that we are all going out and saying, these are the tax advantages? What's your take on that, Yonah? What's your crystal ball say?
I'm not a prophet or a psychic or anything
Fortune
like that.
teller?
You know, it's really up in the air. If they're saying right now what they're saying, what they just came out with about the 1031 exchanges, who knows what they have in store for real estate. I do believe that, you know, now is really the time to take advantage of it if you can. It's maybe not necessarily the best time to buy properties. Obviously, there's different opinions on that. But yeah, take advantage while you can. That's all I'm going to say.
Excellent. Is there anybody in the house that has a question? I'd really like to have somebody ask a question if you have it. Don't hold back.
Come on, Hutch.
Yeah, Hutch,
You
what's
got
going
something
on?
in you.
Don't be hiding behind that.
I'm never hiding. I'm blending in with my environment. Record. No, I don't really have a question, man. We've been following Yonah Weiss for a while, and definitely super knowledgeable. Pretty sure you cover it as far as how to pass that to the investors through a syndication. And I think that's some of the biggest questions that get asked quite often. Yeah, but no, I don't have any other questions.
What can you tell us about, real quickly, social media? How has that helped your business? Is that something that you would recommend as a capital raiser, as a syndicator? What's your 30-second view on that?
Social media is a long-term game, and it's a long play. And I see it as networking, right? So especially LinkedIn, because it's a professional platform, because there's a lot of people out there that are, you know, just driving value. It's branding, okay? It's a way for you, especially creating original content, not just sharing articles, not just like sharing stuff. Creating original content and doing it consistently, daily if possible, but doing it, it's a long game. You're creating community. You're creating a brand awareness. You're making people aware that what you do. And if you're doing it authentically and you're doing it with kind of the vision, the outlook to add value to others, it's incredible how much response you can get from people. And I mean, I can't tell you how, I mean, for syndicators, there's a bunch of syndicators doing it, right? But there's so many different niches involved. There's so many different kind of communities, and there's not a lot of people doing it right. I'll tell you that. So
Maybe we have to have you come back another time to talk to us about that. Because, you know, when you see Yonah, if you guys have not connected with Yonah, as I said at the beginning, you're going to see him all over LinkedIn. And you'll see the power that his information and the content and just his presence has. And you're going to be like, I was in the same room with Yonah Weiss. This is so cool. He came to talk to us. Okay, so think about it. It might not be a big deal right now as you're talking to Yonah, but when you leave here, go check him out on LinkedIn. He's the guy. He is the LinkedIn guy. So unless there's any other questions today, you guys, I appreciate you showing up. That's one thing that you can do to build your business, to have a presence with this community and really grow your business. So I really appreciate you spending an hour with me today, once a week. It's great. Yonah, your content was awesome. I thank you so much for taking time out of your day away from your family. I do appreciate it. And you guys, keep making contacts with each other. This is our family. Each one of you have a value to each other. So find it, create it, present it. We all have value with each other. And remember, if you need something in a property in Augusta, Georgia, or Huntsville, is that right? Huntsville?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Appreciate it.
Okay. Remember who you need to go talk to. Go talk to Justin or Steve Chan, you guys. Thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next week. Have a good one.
Bye.
Please be safe.